Tonight, we step into the slick, rain-soaked streets of Stockholm, February 28, 1986, a city of orderly facades, neon reflections, and whispers of political tension. On Swedish, a man walked home with his wife, ordinary as any Swede on an ordinary night. But in the shadows of a streetlight, the ordinary curdled into horror. 2 shots rang out, a body collapsed, and the Prime Minister of Sweden lay dying on asphalt that will remember him forever. No one saw the killer. No one could explain why. And yet, within hours, the city's calm fractured, every corner, every witness, every rumor brimming with suspicion. The police called it murder. The nation called it unthinkable. And decades later, we're still chasing the man who disappeared into the night. The night was ink black. Stockholm streets shimmered with rain, reflecting neon signs like broken mirrors. And then, bang, 2 shots. One man slumped into the shadow of a grocery store. Olof Palme, Sweden's prime minister, lying in the middle of Swedish, dead before anyone could even process the noise. A woman screams, clutching her shopping bag as if it could shield her from the impossible. A man runs past, pretending he didn't see. The city freezes. And nobody, absolutely nobody, sees the killer. There are no traces, no fingerprints, no confession, just a bullet and a question mark. So why did it swallow the entire nation? What haunts me the most isn't just that Palme was shot. It's the casualness of it all. He was walking home with his wife, just like any citizen. And yet in that ordinary step lies a horror story that refuses to end. I keep thinking, a world where a man can be assassinated on a crowded street, and the streets themselves conspire to forget. Is that paranoia or reality? And here's the kicker. Within seconds, Stockholm transformed from a familiar city to a labyrinth of suspicion. Shadows twisted, friends looked like strangers, and suddenly, every whisper of political dissent felt like a possible clue to an unspeakable conspiracy. Imagine being there. Imagine standing on that wet asphalt, the smell of rain and exhaust heavy in your lungs, watching a man die while everything else moves as if nothing happened. The police arrive, flashlights cutting through mist, faces drawn, mouths moving but no one really speaking. And for decades afterward, this moment gnaws at Sweden's collective skull. The Prime Minister murdered in plain view, the killer slipping into the night, like a ghost with Stockholm's entire heart in his pocket. People say it's unsolved. But unsolved doesn't cover the way it festers. It doesn't cover the theories, the endless court of whispers, the endless paranoia that maybe, just maybe, anyone standing next to you on a rainy street could be the one who pulled the trigger. And worse, some of those theories are so weird, so grotesquely imaginative, that they make the actual crime feel almost tame. There are spies, extremists, petty criminals, international conspiracies, all spinning around a single, uncatchable shadow. And the strangest part? Even today, decades later, there's a terrifying intimacy to it. You can replay the moment in your head, hear the shots, see Palme fall, and somewhere in the murky folds of history, the killer or killers still exists in some unrecorded alley, untraced fingerprint, unspoken secret. This isn't a story about politics. It isn't a story about fame. It's a story about fear that can settle in the middle of a bustling street and wait decades before you notice it's there. And that's the part that chills me most. The ordinary world shredded in a second, and the question that refuses to die. Who did it? Sweden in the 1980s was a country that looked like a postcard but hummed with tension beneath the surface. Picture it. Orderly streets, blonde-haired children biking past red-painted wooden houses, the occasional moose in the distance, and citizens confident in their social democracy. But don't be fooled by the idyllic photos. Behind the facades of coffee houses and orderly bureaucracies, the air was thick with political anxiety, whispers of Cold War espionage, and a public grappling with a rapidly changing global stage. The Scandinavian calm was an illusion, like a frozen lake that conceals churning currents beneath. Stockholm itself was a paradox. Sleek, modern, proud of its egalitarian ideals, yet riddled with contradictions. Palaces and banks coexisted with crime-ridden suburbs. Police forces had efficient routines, yet intelligence networks were fragmented, overlapping, often blind to the darker currents flowing under the city's polished exterior. And in this city of dualities, Olof Palme walked a fine line, a figure of moral authority, a polarizing politician, a man whose every public move was scrutinized as if the nation itself were holding its breath. The world outside Sweden was volatile. The Cold War churned. The Soviet Union flexed. NATO maneuvered. Assassinations and covert operations weren't just news. They were existential threats. Stockholm, while seemingly serene, wasn't immune. Intelligence agents shuffled through shadowy cafes. Diplomats whispered behind closed doors, and extremist factions nursed grudges both ideological and personal. In the midst of all this, a democratic society that prided itself on transparency had vulnerabilities, and Palme, for all his charisma and moral certainty, was walking straight into them. There was a social psychology to this era that's hard to capture. People trusted the system. They genuinely believed that the state could protect its citizens, that law and order were omnipresent. And yet, beneath that trust simmered a gnawing fear that violence could erupt anywhere, that someone with the right motive or the wrong mind could pierce the bubble of normalcy. That fear didn't just whisper in newspapers or political meetings. It lived in the streets, in the parks, in the corners of Stockholm where streetlights flickered and pigeons gathered in suspicious clusters. Even the culture was layered with tension. Music, literature, and theater were all reflecting a society aware of its contradictions. Artists and intellectuals debated the morality of neutrality, the ethics of power, the fragility of human life. In that environment, a public figure like Palme wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol, a moral anchor, a target in the eyes of those who opposed everything he represented. And yet, for all its careful order, Sweden was just a city waiting for the imperceptible to strike. One rainy night, one intersection, one ordinary walk home would rupture the illusion, the idyllic postcard of Swedish life. Its social trust, its calm streets, its belief in safety would be torn in half. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the drama, chilling and unresolved, was about to begin. Olof Palme. Imagine a man who could fill a room with conviction, without ever raising his voice, whose presence was both comforting and unnerving. To some, he was the moral compass of Sweden, a visionary steering a nation toward equality, human rights, and a voice on the global stage. To others, he was a meddler, an abrasive provocateur, a thorn in the side of governments and intelligence agencies across the world. Palme was impossible to ignore, whether you admired him or despised him. He grew up in privilege but had the rare gift or curse of empathy. He wasn't content with abstract policy. He wanted to touch lives, change them, mold the moral character of a nation. But there was a subtle paradox. The very qualities that made him beloved also made him dangerous. His moral absolutism, his refusal to compromise on issues he deemed vital, created enemies quietly, invisibly, in the shadows. And here's the psychological rub. Palme's brilliance was also his vulnerability. By stepping into the streets without bodyguards on the night he died, he displayed a trust in humanity, so profound it was almost naive, a blind spot that would cost him his life. He had survived political storms before, survived accusations, protests, and international scrutiny. But the late 1980s were a crescendo of pressure. Globally, leaders were being targeted, nations destabilized, ideology breeding violence. Domestically, Sweden had its own extremist factions, radical leftists, radical rightists, disenfranchised zealots who saw Palme as a symbol of everything they hated. And yet, he walked among them like a man who believed that engagement, human, direct, personal, was stronger than walls and weapons. Palme's personal life mirrored this contradiction. A devoted husband, a father, a man whose public persona was almost saintly. Yet private letters reveal a restless mind, an awareness that threats lurked even in daylight. He had been warned before, of course. Threats circulated, whispered in halls, recorded in intelligence files. But the Swedish approach was different. Trust in law and order, in society's collective morality. They underestimated the darkness, and Palme, with characteristic courage or recklessness, depending on who you ask, underestimated it too. And then there's the image of him walking home with his wife that fateful night. No entourage, no armored limousine, just ordinary coats, ordinary steps, ordinary life. That ordinary image is what makes the tragedy feel so visceral. Palme wasn't just a politician, he was someone who dared to live in a normal way, and that normality became a weapon against him. The contrast is almost absurd. The man who shaped a nation's conscience fell by a single act of chaos on an otherwise banal Stockholm street. To understand Palme is to confront the uncomfortable. Greatness and vulnerability, idealism and risk, morality and mortality, all entwined. And it's in this entanglement that the horror of what happened that night begins to grip, not just as history, but as a psychological paradox. A man so alive with purpose, snuffed out in a single heartbeat, leaving behind questions that refuse to die. It happened fast. Too fast for the mind to catch. Too ordinary for the world to anticipate. February 28, 1986. Just another Friday night. Stockholm drenched in winter cold and the faint scent of melted snow. Palme and his wife, Lisbeth, were walking home from the cinema. No security detail, no caution tape, just a casual, human evening. They strolled through the city as though nothing extraordinary could happen. And then it did. A man, cloaked in darkness and anonymity, stepped from the crowd. 2 shots rang out. 1 bullet struck Palme in the back, piercing flesh and history simultaneously. He fell, almost gracefully, like a man resigning to a fate no one could have foreseen. Lisbeth's screams shattered the urban calm. People swarmed. Chaos collided with disbelief. And the killer vanished, swallowed by shadows, leaving behind nothing but echoing questions and a city in collective shock. The first disturbance wasn't just a shooting. It was the rupture of normalcy. Sweden prided itself on safety, on order, on a social contract that implied, implicitly, you could walk home at night without fear of being murdered. That illusion shattered in an instant. Imagine the psychological tremor. 1 man, assassinated, and the entire population forced to confront the fragility of life, the unpredictability of human malice. Ordinary citizens felt exposed, as though the very air they breathed had been corrupted, and the crime scene, it was almost surreal. Rain-slick asphalt reflecting neon lights. A body lying face down in the street. A city that refused to stop moving, as if ignoring death could erase it. Eyewitnesses spoke in stammers and half-formed sentences, each account fragmentary, contradictory, as if the human mind could only grasp pieces of reality too sharp to hold. Some recalled a man in a dark coat. Some swore the killer was running west. Others said they saw nothing at all. The contradictions themselves became evidence of disorder, of a world that had suddenly turned arbitrary and hostile. Even the police were unprepared. Stockholm, despite being a modern, ordered city, had no protocols for a head-of-state assassination in the middle of a street. Investigators scrambled. Radio alerts blared. Forensic teams fumbled with a scene that had been contaminated by the very crowds meant to help. Within minutes, the first seeds of confusion were sown, and with confusion came something even darker. Suspicion. Who could have done this? Why? And why now? Palme's murder didn't just create a crime. It created a vacuum, a gap in reality that authorities, citizens, and even historians would struggle to fill. The ordinary world had been violated, and in that violation, the first tremors of decades-long mystery began to pulse. The disturbance wasn't just physical, it was existential. A society forced to confront that murder wasn't an isolated act, but a signal that something, someone, was willing to pierce the heart of Swedish normalcy without warning, without trace, without regret. And here's where it gets truly maddening. Because the shooting itself was almost clean, too clean. No obvious motive, no eyewitness able to give a clear description, no fingerprints. No getaway car, nothing but two echoes of bullets and a body sprawled across the asphalt. For a case that should have had immediate leads, the investigation immediately splintered into chaos. And in that chaos, the public's imagination ran wild. Conflicting testimonies piled up like storm debris. One witness swore they saw a man in a hooded jacket, sprinting east. Another insisted the figure ran west. Some claimed they glimpsed a tall, thin silhouette. Others a short, stocky one. It was as if reality itself refused to be pinned down, laughing quietly at everyone who tried. And then the theories began to bloom, each more grotesque than the last. Was it a lone fanatic? A radical political cell? International intelligence services playing chess on Swedish streets? The more people speculated, the more impossible the truth seemed to approach. Sweden's own intelligence agencies stumbled over themselves. Secret files surfaced, then disappeared. Leads were ignored or followed in the wrong direction. At times, it seemed as though the country's very institutions were conspiring to confuse themselves. And yet, despite the fog, the one certainty remained. The world had lost a man, and someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. The detective work felt like chasing ghosts through a hall of mirrors, each reflection slightly off, each shadow pointing in multiple directions at once. Public reaction was electric, anxious, and surreal. Crowds gathered at candlelit vigils, whispers of conspiracy curling around every conversation. Newspapers printed page after page of speculation, and the collective imagination of a nation stretched thin, straining to hold multiple contradictory realities at once. Radical theorists claimed foreign plots. Conspiracy theorists whispered that the assassination was orchestrated to destabilize Sweden's neutrality in a volatile world. Even ordinary citizens, when asked, would hedge their statements, as if acknowledging the impossibility of truth had become a moral obligation. And then, of course, there was the absurdity of it all. Politicians arguing over the impossible, detectives chasing phantoms, international media painting Stockholm as a stage for Cold War intrigue, when in reality, the city was a normal city until someone pulled a trigger. The deeper the investigation went, the thicker the fog. What was supposed to be a clear crime became a labyrinth, where every clue was either misleading, misinterpreted, or deliberately obfuscated. By the end of the first weeks, the murder of Olof Palme had evolved into a phenomenon, an unsolved enigma that refused to yield. The city, the country, the world, all collectively felt the unsettling tick of uncertainty. Maybe no one would ever know. And maybe that's what made it so terrifying. The notion that the ordinary, orderly life could be interrupted arbitrarily and leave behind a shadow that stretches decades into the future. The investigation into Palme's murder is a masterclass in chaos masquerading as procedure. Imagine hundreds of officers, investigators, and intelligence agents scouring Stockholm, yet every lead felt like chasing fog. Early on, the police were flooded with tips. Thousands of them, most useless, some deliberately misleading. Every anonymous letter, every suspicious phone call became a potential clue, but more often than not, they were red herrings meant to keep the investigation spinning in circles. The first major theory pointed to the lone gunman, a random extremist, acting in anger or ideology. Sweden had radical groups, yes, and some had motive, but nothing concrete ever materialized. Investigators traced names, checked alibis, interrogated suspects. Each thread ended either in a dead end or in contradictions so severe they seemed almost designed to mock logic itself. Then came the more elaborate theories. Cold War intrigue, a KGB plot, CIA machinations, organized crime retaliation. Palme was a man whose moral positions had irritated politicians across Europe and the world. Yet the deeper you dive, the stranger it gets. These were not just theories. They were labyrinths of psychological speculation, each one pulling in a slightly different narrative. Could it really be that a simple stroll home could intersect with international espionage in the most grotesque coincidence imaginable? Possibly. It didn't matter that the probability seemed absurd. The case thrived on absurdity. There were also domestic suspects, a motley mix of disgruntled ex-police, extremist fringe groups, even ordinary criminals with no political ideology at all. One notable example is Christer Pettersson, a petty criminal and drug addict who was eventually convicted, then acquitted, after years of legal tug-of-war. Eyewitness testimony wobbled like a drunk tightrope walker. Lisbeth Palme identified him, yet other accounts didn't match. Courts found no certainty. And so, like a ghost story, Pettersson became both a suspect and a symbol of the uncertainty surrounding the case. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies quietly bickered. What was overlooked? What was misfiled? Reports surfaced that Swedish authorities may have ignored early leads pointing to foreign operatives. Perhaps there was caution, or perhaps incompetence. Perhaps both. The public, naturally, became suspicious of the very agencies meant to protect them. And in that suspicion, the mystery fed itself. The lines between logic and paranoia blurred. Each piece of evidence a potential truth, each gap in the investigation an invitation to conspiracy. Even decades later, the theories persist, multiply like cells in a petri dish. A man walks home in Stockholm, and suddenly he's at the center of geopolitical intrigue, criminal negligence, and societal anxiety. It's almost absurd, but that absurdity is exactly why Palme's assassination refuses to settle into history neatly. The investigation did its best, or perhaps did what it could within a system that was simultaneously competent, bureaucratic, and maddeningly blind. The truth, if it exists, is still tangled somewhere beneath reports, witness statements, and international paranoia. The strangest moment in the entire saga isn't the shooting itself. It's the way the investigation fractured under its own weight. It was 1988 when Christer Pettersson, the petty criminal dragged from obscurity into a nightmare of headlines, was convicted of Palme's murder. Sweden collectively exhaled, thinking maybe finally justice had a name. But then the acquittal. Appeals courts overturned the conviction in 1989, citing unreliable witness testimony and lack of forensic certainty. The nation's hope didn't just crack, it splintered. And this is where the story turns almost surreal. The police have been chasing leads like rabbits in a hall of mirrors. False tips, contradictory reports, missing evidence, and international red herrings. Every new theory seemed to unravel an old one. Intelligence files went missing. Bureaucratic errors multiplied, and the public's trust eroded faster than the city's winter ice under spring sun. The narrative of law and order, a methodical investigation, collapsed under its own weight, leaving only confusion and speculation. Then came the whispers of more sinister possibilities. Could this have been a political assassination orchestrated by someone so powerful that no Swedish agency dared follow the trail? Some detectives believed in lone killers, others in organized plots, and the theories began to feel like competing myths rather than actionable lines of inquiry. Each turn in the investigation revealed gaps where logic should have been, and the psychological toll was immense. Investigators, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike became obsessed, some to the point of obsession-induced paranoia, trying to fill holes that might never be feasible. Pettersson's acquittal was more than a legal reversal. It was a national psychological fracture. People argued in cafes, in offices, in newspapers. Could anyone ever be held accountable? Could a democratic society, proud of its fairness and transparency, face a crime so raw and so chaotic without a solution? And yet, despite the failure of the courts, the case refused to disappear. Every anniversary of the shooting reignites public debate, as if Stockholm itself remembers and refuses to forgive the ambiguity. The breakdown wasn't just institutional, it was emotional, philosophical. How do you live in a society that prides itself on safety when the man who represented moral certainty can be felled by bullets on an ordinary street? How do you reconcile the idea of justice with the stark evidence of randomness, chaos, and human malice? In the Palme case, the breakdown wasn't just procedural. It was existential. It forced the nation, and anyone daring to follow the trail of events, to confront the fragile, unpredictable architecture of order and morality. And in that fracture, the story takes on an almost mythic quality. A man assassinated, a suspect convicted then released, a trail of evidence disappearing into bureaucratic limbo. Reality itself seemed to stagger under the weight of possibility. The turning point, if you can call it that, wasn't a single discovery. It was a slow, relentless realization that some truths, some crimes, simply refused to be contained, named, or understood. And here we reach the place where the story refuses to give comfort, because, officially, Olof Palme's murder remains unsolved. Decades of investigation, wild theories, courtroom dramas, and public speculation have not produced a universally accepted answer. The mystery persists, hovering over Sweden like a storm cloud that never breaks, teasing a resolution that never arrives. In 2020, Swedish prosecutors declared the case technically closed, pointing to Stig Engström, a graphic designer who was long suspected but never charged. Engström had been present near the crime scene, provided inconsistent statements, and had a vague motive rooted in personal grievances. But he had died in 2000. The decision was pragmatic. A living suspect was gone, evidence was scant, and pursuing justice was no longer feasible. Yet, to the public, this felt like a hollow ending. Closing a case on the basis of death alone is not justice. It's a narrative convenience. And the lingering questions remain sharper than ever. Was Engström truly the killer, or merely a convenient scapegoat decades later? Could there have been more than one perpetrator, acting in a conspiracy invisible to both the public and investigators? Were there international interests, intelligence operatives, or domestic extremists involved, whose fingerprints would forever remain untraceable? Each unanswered question twists tighter around the facts we think we know. The ambiguity has become part of the crime itself, the psychological residue that refuses to dissipate. Witness testimonies, contradictory and incomplete, continue to fuel debate. Police procedural errors, missing files, and forgotten leads suggest that even if we wanted certainty, the very architecture of the investigation makes it impossible. It's as if the murder was not only a violent act, but a surgical disruption of the very mechanisms designed to uncover truth. And in that, there's a kind of chilling symmetry. A nation built on trust and transparency left to wrestle with its first modern political assassination, and left with nothing but shadows and speculation. The closure that prosecutors offered: we have a likely suspect. The trail has gone cold. Reads like a bureaucratic sigh. It is not satisfying. It is not complete. It does not soothe the gnawing question that began in 1986. Who pulled the trigger? And why? And in those unanswered spaces, imagination thrives. Conspiracy theories, scholarly analyses, and late-night debates fill the void, each one a reflection of society's refusal to let go, each one a testament to the psychological impact of a crime that defies resolution. So the resolution, or lack thereof, is not a neat line. It is a series of fractures, open-ended and uncomfortable. Sweden lives with the echo of a prime minister's last footsteps. The city remembers, the nation debates, and the world still wonders. Perhaps the case is unsolvable because the act itself was designed to transcend ordinary comprehension, a violent punctuation mark on a society that believed itself too civilized, too safe, to encounter chaos in the streets of its capital. The ripples of Palme's assassination stretched far beyond Stockholm's wet streets and into the very psyche of Sweden. A nation that had once believed in its invulnerability was forced to confront fragility on a mass scale. Ordinary citizens, who had taken for granted the safety of walking home at night, now felt the air itself charged with uncertainty. It was as if the murder had punctured not only the body of a prime minister, but the collective sense of security that had cocooned Swedish society for decades. Politically, the assassination shook the Social Democratic Party and sent tremors through the nation's governance. Leaders who had once operated under the assumption that Sweden was immune to political violence that plagued other countries now had to reevaluate everything, from security protocols to international alliances. Streets that had been taken for granted became sites of scrutiny, and public spaces transformed psychologically into potential crime scenes. Ordinary acts of life, walking, commuting, even going to the cinema, were shadowed by the awareness that violence could strike at any time. The cultural legacy is equally striking. Palme's murder has been referenced in literature, theater, and film, often as a cautionary tale about the intersection of idealism and vulnerability. Artists explore the paradox of a man who championed human rights and walked freely among citizens, only to be struck down in a moment of unprovoked violence. Public discourse remains haunted by questions of morality, justice, and trust in institutions. Memorials and anniversaries keep his presence alive, not only as a political figure, but as a symbol of the fragility of societal order. There are also psychological scars. Sweden collectively endured what psychologists might describe as a trauma loop, repeatedly reliving the event through news cycles, anniversary reflections, and unresolved legal proceedings. The fascination with the case has fed a persistent national obsession with justice, morality, and the human capacity for sudden violence. It's a rare instance where a single act of brutality reshaped a country's cultural and emotional consciousness in ways that are still palpable decades later. Internationally, Palme's assassination served as a reminder that no democratic society, however orderly or peaceful, is immune to the randomness of human malevolence or the calculated agendas of political extremists. Sweden, often idealized as a beacon of stability, had its own dark lesson embedded in that February night. A lesson in vulnerability, uncertainty, and the unpredictable consequences of moral prominence. Even today, when journalists revisit the case or when documentaries air, there's a palpable tension in the collective memory. Palme's death is not just a historical event. It's a lingering presence, a shadow that stretches into political discourse, cultural memory, and national identity. It is a reminder that some crimes do not end. They echo, they haunt, and they redefine societies they touch. Decades later, standing in the rain-slick streets of Stockholm, you can almost hear the ghost of that February night whispering through the city. There's something disturbingly poetic about the fact that a man who sought to walk among his people, who believed in dialogue over barricades, could be felled by the randomness of a bullet. Palme's assassination is a reminder that history doesn't just happen in grand, orchestrated moments. It sometimes explodes in ordinary spaces, in the split second when a man takes a single step too far. And yet, there's a dark admiration in the story, a strange respect for the sheer audacity of life's unpredictability. Sweden, with its meticulously ordered streets and societal trust, was confronted with the chaos of human malice in its purest form. The case forces us to stare into the abyss of uncertainty, the abyss of morality, the abyss of a world where justice is not guaranteed and the innocent can die in broad daylight. It mocks our desire for neat conclusions and reminds us that some truths are deliberately, excruciatingly elusive. Think about the ordinary people on Svevigen that night. The shoppers, the commuters, the children watching from windows, all of them witnesses to a randomness that rewrote the rules of their existence. And then consider the investigators, journalists, and citizens who spent years piecing together fragments, only to confront the reality that human memory is fallible, evidence is incomplete, and motives can vanish into shadows. It's a cruel reminder that our lives are often subject to forces beyond comprehension. Chance, choice, and malevolence entwine in ways that defy reason. And here's the chilling finality. Even if we were to accept Stig Engstrom as the killer, the narrative is unsatisfying, incomplete. The motivations, the context, the psychological intricacies, so much is lost time. The crime lives on in whispers and theories, in the restless imagination of a nation unwilling to close the book entirely. Palme's death is both a historical fact and an eternal question mark, suspended in the mind of anyone who dares to ask why. So, in the end, the story is not just about a man or his murder. It is about the fragility of trust, the unpredictable intersection of chance and intent, and the shadows that linger long after the lights of reason fade. Olof Palme walked through ordinary streets and into an extraordinary, unresolved nightmare. And Stockholm, Sweden, and the world continue to feel the tremors of that one night. A reminder that sometimes history's coldest lessons are delivered not in war, not in headlines, but in the quiet click of trigger and the echoes that follow. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.